We often say that Jesus spent time with the marginalized, or that churches are called to minister with people on the margins. And in a certain sense, that's true, maybe from the perspective of society, or even from the perspective of our churches. But theologian John Swinnon challenges us with a different perspective. He says there's something more radical happening in the Gospels, that Jesus didn't just journey with those who society excluded, he actually shifted the margins entirely. In sitting with such people, he says, Jesus, who was and is God, actually shifted the margins. By shifting the margins, with a push aside at the center, the religious authorities became the marginalized. They didn't realize that Jesus had moved the margins to a totally different place. Think about that. Those of us with power, knowledge, and religious authority often find ourselves on the outside looking in at what God is doing. The kingdom of God is being revealed through those who we've often overlooked. This isn't ancient history. It's happening every day in our churches right now. I'm Keith Dow, manager of organizational and spiritual life with Charis Disability Services in Canada. For almost 2 decades now, I have had the privilege of working alongside people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, first in a direct support role, and now helping shape how our organization and churches think about faith, care, and belonging. So if you're tuning in today, you already care deeply about mental health and the church. You know how important it is that our congregations become places of refuge and healing. But there's one group that we often miss when we're talking about mental health in the church: people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Disability and mental health struggles often go hand in hand. So data from 2022 shows that 27% of Canadians have a disability and 1.5% of Canadians have an intellectual or developmental disability. Mental health-related disabilities were the fastest growing kind, now at 10.4% of the population. Over 9 in 10 people with developmental disabilities had at least one other type of disability. 66% had a mental health-related disability. Churches are called to be places of belonging, but for many people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families, they remain hard to access, not just physically, but relationally and spiritually. Many of the families that we've worked with or have gotten to know have been asked to leave because one of their children is being too disruptive, or they just haven't had their accessibility needs met and so aren't able to worship fully in that space. Others have drifted away quietly, not quite feeling like they belong. So the question becomes, what kind of churches are we called to be? Are we quietly reinforcing limits and boundaries, or are we shifting the margins like Jesus did? This is the vision that I want to share with you today. It's grounded in a project that I had the opportunity to do. There was a collaboration between Charis Disability Services and Martin Luther University College in Waterloo. And it was through the University of Birmingham, funded by a John Templeton Foundation grant. It's called Images of God Through the Lens of Disability. I worked with 11 Christians with intellectual disabilities across Ontario. We used photography, collage making, interviews, and visual tools to help explore how they understand God and see themselves. Participants weren't just subjects, they were artists, co-theologians, storytellers. Their insights speak powerfully to faith, suffering, mental health, and the image of God in all of us. As Paul writes, the parts of the body that seem to be weaker are actually indispensable. And when people with intellectual disabilities and their families are welcomed into communities, not as just recipients of care, but as contributors, when they're seen as bearers of wisdom and creativity, our churches become more spacious, more grounded in the gospel, not just inclusive, but transformed. Through this work, there were 6 themes that emerged. First, God reaches down. Everyday incarnation, how people connected with God in the world. Secondly, some of the barriers to that. You need a magnifying glass, barriers to faith and understanding. Third, was best friends for life, belonging to God and one another, that relationality. And the fourth was kind of the reverse of that. What happens when that falls apart? It still hurts, grief, loss, and divine comfort. Fifth, I could conquer the world, self-worth and transformation on the journey of faith. And then sixth, I was helping the people, living faith through action. I'd like to share some insights from this work that can help shape who we are as church communities in powerful ways. Let's talk about the first theme, God reaches down. This is one of the clearest that emerged through the work, how people encounter God in the ordinary material world around them. This theme came to be called God Reaches Down, language from Patricia in Ottawa. She had taken a picture of a tree in the fall, bright leaves against a blue sky. Here's how she describes it in her own words.
There's some red, brown, some yellow.
Yeah. It really stands out how you took that picture.
It's read down and you put hands on top and change the colors.
Say that again?
God has to hold his hand and you will it's on the top of the tree and just the colors.
He reaches down and
the green into different colors in the fall time.
Right. Yeah, so you see God kind of actively changing.
You don't see him, typically.
Right,
you see him in heaven.
Yeah, so he's in heaven and reaches down and changes
the colors of the trees.
Yeah, that's neat.
I love how Patricia is able to so concisely put her finger on what it means for God to work in and through creation, and that she doesn't hesitate to correct me when she says, no, we don't see God, but he does, and he works in our world regardless. She's talking about seeing God in the world in a way that is tangible, not just a distant or abstract idea of God. A world that is alive with God's touch, where the changing leaves, the color of them is part of how God reaches into our everyday lives. The same awareness showed up in others as well. So Maria talked about what it was like to take a picture of a squirrel as part of her photo voice project. And they're so busy, they run around all the time. But she said that the squirrel seemed to pose for me that day. Maybe Jesus helped me. I think Jesus helped me take a picture of the squirrel. Ray spoke about how creative God is, that he can be an artist. Every day he's an artist. And so every moment that we witness God working in and through our world is like a new artistic collaboration between us and God. And Lise spoke to just, wow, is this what God created? It's a beautiful sight to see. The sky, the birds, the trees. As Christians, we don't just see the world as natural, it's created. Scripture tells us that through him all things were made, and in him all things hold together. These participants remind us paying attention to the world is one way that we pay attention to God and the way that he's at work in the world around us. How would our churches and our communities and our practices be different if we grew an appreciation for what it means to serve God together, not only within the four walls of our church, but also in the course of our everyday lives, in walks in nature, around a campfire, etc., etc. Second theme was around barriers. And so while participants described a rich awareness of God's presence, they also spoke honestly about the barriers that they face, especially in trying to access Christian teaching or participate in church life. Maria talked about how she would watch movies and with her mom as she learned about Jesus, and how she listens to the audio Bible. Because when she talks about the written Bible, she says, the writing is so small, yeah, you need a magnifying glass to see it. This became the title of this theme. And it's not just about small print. It's about the feeling that faith can be hard to grasp when it's presented in ways that don't match how you learn or communicate. Lee shares that I feel like I've lost a bit of my faith, and I need to ask him again to forgive me because I stopped going to church because I don't know the Bible and I don't understand the Bible. I get so confused and I get all tied up and I kind of lose myself within there. It's like I'm in a knot, and it's like I want to try to get loose. Lise highlights a challenge for all of us. How do we relate to and understand the ineffable God of the universe? So often we design spiritual formation around understanding first. But what if love and belonging are the foundation, not comprehension? We learn best when people take the time to understand what we need and how we learn. And there are lots of organizations like CARES Disability Services that can come alongside your church and your community to do a better job of this, how we communicate, how we relate to others. And it makes a difference for everybody. It makes a difference for all of us. The third theme was best friends for life. Participants described how their relationships with God, with families, with friends, and even with their pets are central to how they understand who God is and who they are. Durrell called his friend Elizabeth his BFFL, or best friend for life. And he related this to his experience of God. He says that God is a good friend who listens to me, and he is nice with me. Ryan put it simply, God made people, he made them to love each other. In Daniela's photo voice journal, she said, I took this picture, which is a kind of collage of a number of different people that she knew, with the people because they make me feel loved. I wanted to tell you that you are not alone and not to give up on the community. There is always someone who cares about you. Theologians like Thomas Reynolds urge us to see the image of God as fundamentally relational. We image God not in our cognitive or our isolated capacities, but in our ability to give and receive love. Welcome is at the heart of reality, he writes, reminding us that belonging is not earned, but given. This echoes the opening affirmation of Scripture. Let us make human beings in our image. To exist is to be invited into life, into relationship, into God's own communion. Faith is relational at its core, and it doesn't depend on what we do or have or can produce. When we make space for friendship, for mutual care, for presence that doesn't require performance, we reflect the image of God who welcomes us first. In such a community, people don't have to earn belonging. We experience it. Of course, when we talk about faith, we can't just talk about joy and belonging. For many of the participants, for many of us, grief is a part of that journey as well. And so the fourth theme is it still hurts. Grief, loss, and divine comfort. This is kind of the flip side of belonging. When we lose someone or something that we care deeply about, or it's made a difference in our faith journey. Lori from Kingston shared a picture of her family's gravesite. She said, they're all in heaven, but it still hurts. I'm very sad and depressed about it. This shows that parallel structure that we can hold faith, we can hold confidence that people that we've cared about are in a better place, but still acknowledge the reality of where we're at with that grief, with that suffering, with that loss. Those two things happen together. Durrell similarly shared, I cry when my grandma died, she up in heaven. My cousin died, I was upset, I love him, I miss him. For Ryan, he's still wrestling through the effects of childhood bullying, and several other participants were as well. We spoke about her fear of death. Why am I so afraid? I can get confused and tied up and lose myself. There's no hiding the sorrow in these conversations, but neither was there despair. Lori, who we shared the picture of from the gravesite, also shared with me the following.
Well, Jesus is called the Prince of Peace. And I like my peace. Everybody likes the peace and quiet. So and it feels like I got so much going on. I'm stressed out. I'm overwhelmed. But I read the Bible every day, and it makes me feel better.
And so we see here how that acknowledgement of our own stress, our own concerns, is accompanied by this knowledge that Jesus is the Prince of Peace who we can reach out and be connected with. The fifth theme was I could conquer the world, self-worth and transformation. The theme of pain gives way to strength. Daniela, reflecting on her first communion, said, even though I have seizures, I felt like I could conquer the world. I felt like I was a princess. She wrote, my first communion was one of the most important days of my life to celebrate because I was giving God my heart and life. And so we see how this is not only a one-time event, but something she keeps coming back to as a reminder of God's goodness and faithfulness. Frank wears different kinds of necklaces, and one of them says, resist the devil. And this necklace, he says, reminds him to resist the devil, to stay positive. And then there was Lori, who marked herself actually on the lowest point of the scale. We were doing this exercise where people were to say, how much do you think this is? A self-esteem assessment. And one of the statements was, I like myself. And most people were putting themselves fairly high. I often think that I like myself. Lori actually put herself at number 1. And she said, I never think of myself that way. I think of other people. I'm a sweet, kind, gentle soul. I love that, how she has this self-confidence and yet at the same time expresses that Christian virtue of humility. Too often, people with disabilities are viewed through the lens of what they can't do. But here we see people who know their worth, not in spite of the limitations, but through the relationships, practices, and faith that have formed them. We hear how people have been through hard times and the stories of God's work in their lives, how this helps sustain us and give us strength for each day as well. And then we learn our own practices of connecting and staying connected to God and one another. And then the final theme is living faith through action. For all 11 participants, faith wasn't just something that they felt or something that they believed. It's something that they lived out and acted upon, both in service to their communities and in spiritual practices and acts of daily worship to help them stay rooted and to grow. So Michelle from Toronto shared that she makes empanadas. She sells them to raise money for her ministry work in Ecuador. She says, I was helping the people because of people, helping them see what Michelle and Jesus get together, help the people around the world. Isn't that beautiful? Ryan similarly serves at the Lighthouse, supporting people who experience homelessness in Aurelia, cleans toilets, takes out garbage, just to help out, he says. Frank has served at the Society for over 20 years. And Lori, as we see, prays to God 6 times a day. That's these regular spiritual practices that help her to grow and live out her faith. From a mental health perspective, this matters. Spiritual practices and acts of service help us move outside of ourselves, especially in times of stress, anxiety, and difficulty. As the prayer of St. Francis reminds us, it is in giving that we receive. I was deeply encouraged. I received a lot from the time that I spent interviewing these 11 participants. Yes, there are a lot of intersections between mental health and disability in our churches. There's a lot of work to be done, but there's a lot that we have to learn from each other as well, both as people who are limited and people who are gifted in walking our own mental health journeys. Faith is lived, it's not earned, and everybody has something to give. Across all themes, participants offer a rich and emotionally grounded theology of divine presence, shaped by everyday experience, relational belonging, and embodied faith. Taken together, these voices witness to a divine reality that is both transcendent and tender. God is not just a distant observer, but artist, friend, and companion in the unfolding stories of our lives. As we come to the end of this presentation, I want to return to the truth that when we design for those who have been marginalized in our churches and society, every one of us benefits. When our churches are reimagined around people with disabilities and mental health challenges, they become more trauma-informed, better at navigating grief and loss, more open to creative expressions of worship, and kinder and gentler spaces for us all, and even for our world. So what are some of the things that churches can actually do here? First, we can start by making services more accessible. through things like plain language, video supports, or multi-sensory worship, embracing diverse ways of connecting with God, such as through some of the creative-based art practices that were featured in this study. We can create better spaces for relationships and not just programs, maybe around activities like service to the community. Durrell talks about the lasagna he makes and how excited he is to share that with others. We can build in times of meaningful relationship around those kinds of activities so people aren't isolated and are reminded that they can contribute. We can recognize people with disabilities and mental health conditions as contributors. Sometimes it means thinking outside typical roles that we see in our church, but considering how people can engage in leadership, prayer, service. We can check assumptions about who can understand, who can teach, who can reflect God. We all have things that we can learn from each other. 1 Corinthians 2 says, "No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has imagined what God has prepared for those who love him." I truly believe this. If we take even these 11 perspectives that were shared here, if we take them seriously, our churches are not just more accessible, they will be more faithful. They will reflect more clearly the God who reaches out, who listens, who stays close in grief and understands it, and who invites everybody into the work of love. Everybody's theology matters. I hope this session has been helpful for you today and helpful for us as we think through what it means for our communities to be kinder and gentler spaces for all of us in our mental health journeys. Thank you.